Okay, well, I should tell you a little bit about Cressip's work. He was studying 19th century politics, and in the period when they still had records of voting, poll books that recorded the name, occupation, and vote of every member of every community. And that was until the 1870s. And during this period, to explain what was happening politically was always explained in terms of what was happening in Parliament, when of course a great deal had to do with the social pressure that was put on people in the countryside to vote the way the owner of the land that they were on wanted them to vote. And with records like this, they had to do so. Anyway, we lived in England while he did this research a number of times. And one of the times in the early 1960s. And you understand what this meant, because in those days, there weren't Xerox machines and there weren't ways of reproducing what you found. So Cressip found that there was some kind of camera on a pillow, a sort of transparent pillow, that he could photograph these poll books. And then we developed them, and the kitchen was hung with two kinds of things. These poll books drying, and the diapers. And the English apartments that we were in were in people's houses, and they were very cold, and I could tell you the history of the various pets we had and their troubles. People who burrowed through the rugs we had. Anyway, what matters in terms of my career is that in the early 1960s, when we were in England, Cressip got an offer from UCLA, and we decided to go. And so in a mid-year time, we moved to California. And we started looking for a house. We stayed in a hotel, and in the drawers of the bureau in the hotel, I found a holster of a gun, one of these holsters that you put under your arm, a shoulder holster. And there were other peculiar things. And then we went to a grocery store, and in the car next to us there were some monkeys, and they were in diapers. And I thought, this California is more strange than I ever thought it would be. But after that, nothing peculiar happened. So, well, a little peculiar things, but they were a natural kind, with a tree falling on somebody because of the rains and so on. But it wasn't somebody we knew. Anyway, what happened was we bought a house which was inexpensive because the valley in which it existed had had fires through the valley, and it had been spared, this house, as many were. The fires skipped houses, and they didn't universally destroy anything. And the result of this was that by chance, the house we were in was next door to an anthropologist's house named Joseph Weckler. He was separated from his wife, so he didn't live in the house, but his wife did, and so did the kids, and I met him. And he was at the University of Southern California. And Southern California, USC, had at that time decided to make the anthropology department vanish. And this was because they had two anthropologists, one of whom was an archaeologist and one of whom was this Weckler guy. And so the archaeologist decided, I see the handwriting on the wall, go to another California university. There were labor shortages in the teaching faculties everywhere, so it was not hard to find a job. And so Weckler became the sole anthropologist at USC, and his department was amalgamated with the sociology department. And he said he badly needed another anthropologist, and they would give him the position if I would take it. And I thought, wowie zowie, this just came across, without trying, without applying, without anything. I mean, he knew about me because I told him about me, but I had not formally done anything to approach the university. Anyway, so he fixed it for me to get a job as an assistant professor at USC. And I thought that was dandy. I didn't like being in the sociology department, but I thought, well, you take what you get. But unfortunately, Weckler was an alcoholic and very depressed. And 5 weeks into the term, he killed himself. So I found myself the only anthropologist at USC and in an alien sociology department. Well, I immediately started being political and trying to get the money for his position given to me to hire some young graduate students from UCLA to supplement the anthropology department. And I did get 2 of them, and I began to feel, things are moving. And indeed, there came a little bit later a time when there was a vacancy in a senior professorship, and I asked that be allocated to anthropology, that they would really begin to have a department if they had a very senior person and me and 2 junior people. And it was allocated to me in the beginning. The sociologists weren't very swift on their feet at that time, but they were later on, and they took that position away from me. But in the beginning, I had it. And actually, it was through that I made my first contact with Harvard, because I tried to get a Harvard person to come for that senior job, a certain person who didn't yet have tenure, but who was on the cusp. Anyhow, this is the kind of university where you had to teach what was in the catalog. It had nothing to do with what you knew or what you were interested in. There were certain kinds of courses, and you had to give them because they were offered, and honor required that the catalog offerings be filled. So I taught things that I'd never heard of before, like American Indians and all sorts of stuff. And it was a very arduous year in that way, because teaching unfamiliar things, and the teaching schedule was not light. It was difficult. But at the same time, things were beginning to make me very happy, because I was beginning to meet people at UCLA, because Kressik was at UCLA, and it wasn't really because of that, because the first person I met was Michael Smith, who had heard of me through Max Lowenthal's son, who was David Lowenthal, who was a professor of geography at University College London. And they had both worked in the Caribbean, because Michael Smith was a Jamaican who had worked in the Caribbean and worked in Africa. And so David Lowenthal told him about me and about my book about power and property in Inca, Peru. And Mike Smith read it and thought it was wonderful. So he got in touch with me. And I was very pleased to know him, and very pleased to, begin to make friends in the profession. And his good friend in the department was Hilda Cooper, who had just come from South Africa. Leo Cooper was in the sociology department, and she was in the anthropology department. So with those 2, I had a rollicking social life. we read many of the same things, we talked about many of the things that interested us. And I became invited to all the seminars and things of interest at UCLA in anthropology. So that although I was isolated at USC with my little junior people, I didn't feel alone. And moreover, I decided that with them, I had to do something that would make us come together. So we ran a seminar with the three of us, always present, and it would concern some topic that interested all of us. And we would have the students doing field work in Los Angeles and producing materials for the seminar. And one of them studied Alcoholics Anonymous, another one studied gangs, another one studied a hippie community. They were all interesting materials because these kids had personal connections with these things. And it was much closer than one might have expected if it had gone from the outside to go study X. So that was going and very, very satisfying. And on the UCLA side, I also found great pleasure in speaking to Smith and speaking to Hilda and talking to them about the things that interested me and that interested them. Now, what happened was, eventually, I was fighting the sociology department politically because they had their eyes on this professorship that I had. And it was a short-term thing. We appointed a man named Guillermo L. Oberg, who was a retired anthropologist who had worked in Latin America. And it was clearly going to be a short-term appointment. And my thought was that we would then be able to appoint somebody younger and more lively and as soon as he retired from that job. But by that time, the sociology department had wised up to the existence of this, and they claimed the professorship. And I was outraged. And I decided to take a year of leave and go to the African Studies Center at UCLA for my year of leave. I was very indignant. I was still not tenured at USC, and I had published more than, or as much as anybody there. I couldn't understand why they didn't tenure me, and I couldn't understand why they were taking this professorship away from my little tiny anthropology group. So I thought, in your face, you'll see, I will simply depart for a year. So I went to the African Studies Center, which was headed by Leo Cooper, and participated in their seminars and in all their activities. And they had a very, very interesting seminar going at the time on pluralism in Africa. And there the questions was ethnicity or class going to be the source of the breakups of the newly independent states, because this was in the 1960s, early 1960s, and they were all being independent and getting rid of their British connections and feeling their muscles. But there was worry about how, the signs that there might be some disintegration. And I was very interested in this political situation. Anyway, that seminar on African pluralism, it turned into a book, of course, in which I did not contribute. But people were brought in who were in African studies from Britain, from France, from all over, and it became a way of connecting with a much wider professional circle, an international professional circle. And they weren't all anthropologists, but they were very interesting people. And at that time then, my relation with Smith and Cooper, or the Coopers, became deeper and more intense because they entertained all the visitors, and I was always included. So that was a tremendous break. And I decided in the course of this that since all the work on legal anthropology, most of the work had been done in Africa, not elsewhere. There were a few things from elsewhere, but Africa was the place where most of it came. And because, as it happened, the British were very much interested, and the French were very much interested, and the Germans were very much interested in the local legal systems, because as successor governments, they wanted to control the people through their own legal system. So that's how anthropologists got into the act. So I decided I must work in Africa, and I studied Swahili at UCLA because I decided I must go to a part of Africa where I can study the language at UCLA. And I identified an area that I thought would be very interesting, namely to go to Tanzania, but to go to the Chaga, who had a cooperative one of the first cooperatives on the continent of Africa, perhaps the first, that was African run and had come into being in the 1920s. And I thought, oh boy, I mean, it's a country that's become socialist. Nyerere has brought socialism to Tanzania, and no doubt that the Chaga will be very enthusiastic about it because they've had this cooperative all this time. Needless to say that they were very anti-Nyerere and anti-socialist, but I didn't know that until I got there. Anyway, I thought this is a very interesting political scene, and I will study their law and also their situation in relation to these larger entities, the colonial government, the socialist government, local government, and so on.
Did you have some help gaining access to the Chaga?
Well, not really, but it turned out that I couldn't be sponsored by the anthropology department because there was no anthropology department. All the African universities had banished them. But the law school was happy. The law school at Dar es Salaam was happy to sponsor me. And it's as a lawyer that I got there. I would not have been acceptable as an anthropologist. I mean, they knew I was an anthropologist. This has to do with rules and fuzziness. They knew I was an anthropologist, but the formal sponsorship was of me as a lawyer. And I didn't know any Chaga, and I didn't know anybody who knew any. So, and the first time we went, Krusov would not let me go by myself. He wanted to see what I was going to see, and he wanted the kids to see too. So we all went as a family. And I started off by going to the local court, which was a quarter of a mile away. And I asked the magistrate if he would let me sit and listen to the hearings, and if he could find somebody who could explain what was going on. Because I said it's one thing to understand the language, which I understand very imperfectly, but to understand what these people mean to each other, I will need somebody to explain these things to me. So he said, I have the man for you. He's worked in the courts elsewhere, and he doesn't come from this village, he comes from a village, some villages away, but I'm sure he will be interested. So I found out what a white-collar person was paid, and I decided, all against everything that I had been taught at Columbia, you mustn't pay informants, you mustn't enter into these kinds of relationships. I decided I would pay him what a white-collar person would get for his time. And we made an arrangement, and I'm still in correspondence with him and his family, and I financed his son going to school in Russia, and it had all sorts of consequences in the long run. But he was at that time quite a young man, and it went well. He spoke enough English mixed with Swahili to explain things to me, and it was very much what I wanted. And we started in this court that was so near where I was staying, but very quickly we started to go to his village and to meet his family and to go to the court that was closer to his village. And I got inside. And from that experience came a great deal of what I've written. I mean, it has many other dimensions, but this was my leg up. And I hired other people. I hired people to teach me more Swahili, a school teacher from the next village, and I hired others because I was sort of feeling the ground to see if this man would work out. But it turned out he was best of all, and the magistrate was quite right to. Then after that, I think I went the next summer. I went many times, and I would have to look at the books to see which years. But it was many times. And at first, of course, I had read the account of Chaga law that was written by a missionary in the early 1900s, published in 1926, but his name was Gutmann. It's full of strange interpretations, but it's very thick and full of information. And I thought, oh well, all this superstition stuff, they've surely rejected it. Because by the time I got there, they were wearing tailor-made clothes and behaving as if they were into the modern world. But it turned out that a lot of this stuff was still floating about in their lives, and that there were a brother jealous of his brother might well work witchcraft on him and keep his wife from bearing children, or make his goats die, or whatever. Any misfortune could have such an explanation. And it isn't that people were sure. They never were sure. But they thought it's a real possibility. And certain people got nailed with these accusations, all very sub rosa, because they didn't want vengeance to be taken on them. So I was surprised, and I went with the flow, and I learned a lot about their intra-lineage disputes. Now, it turned out that the population doubles, I don't know, every 20 years or so. That's the air conditioning
Okay.
making itself manifest. And so the Chaga, who had a population of about 100,000, was the German estimate around 1900, now are somewhere around 700,000 or 800,000. And it's the land shortage is extreme, so that a father can no longer guarantee his sons enough land to grow enough coffee and enough bananas to support himself, his wife, and everything else. So what I also found out was that, in fact, if you do genealogies and do careful understandings of what they're telling you, you begin to understand that people leave, that half of the young people now leave and go to the cities, that in previous generations they left and went up mountain or went down mountain to settle on other lands that were available. And that, so what one looks at is something like an intact traditional society that can only be intact because it sloughs off all the inconveniences. So that was a tremendous revelation to me, and but it was very exciting to learn about these things, because I felt very unsure of myself, very unsure that I wasn't being led by the nose. Why are they telling me this? And thinking, oh well, maybe they think white people are interested in witchcraft, so they tell me this stuff, and it's really to ingratiate themselves with me, and it's not because they really believe it. So I worked in more than one village, more than one family. I was always checking up on myself to see, to try to verify what I had. But the book that gave the full account, because what I did in the book was to give, first of all, a historical account of what happened, and to put the Chaga in the middle of a trading entity that in the 19th century was trading in as far as Lake Victoria and as far as the coast. And they were getting ivory and hoes and slaves and all kinds of things. And all that business was stopped by the colonial entrance because they started to get a monopoly on the trade. And so the Chaga were left extremely high and dry in some of these matters. But I tried to put the historical perspective on it. Somebody had written a history of the Chaga, which was all a history of different chiefdoms and how they fought each other, and which one was dominant and which one wasn't, but it had no other information in it. There are specialist things like that exist, but I was able to put that together with very different kind of information. Then I looked at the courts and some of the court cases in the various periods. And then what I did was make a chronicle of this lineage, which I knew very intimately from the first man who came to help me in the courts. This was his lineage. And their ins and outs, what they did, what they didn't do, what they stole from each other, what they accused each other of. And it's absolutely fascinating to me.
When you were in England, did you circulate in the academy there some?
Yes, very much. Well, what I did, some of this has to do with Mike Smith's life. He decided that his son must not be drafted to go to fight in Vietnam. And so he decided to leave UCLA. There were other reasons, but and he was eventually given the professorship at UCL, at the University College London. And in these many, many trips to England for the year, I went and I went regularly to the seminars at UCL, and I indeed had an appointment there as a visiting something. And I went also to Shapira, to the ones at the London School of Economics. And I was invited to the seminars all around, and including the one at Manchester, because Gluckman by that time was very much interested in me and my work. And he used to stay with Cressup and me when he came to London. Mm-hmm. So there was
what was he like, actually, Gluckman? There are many stories surrounding his personality.
Yes. Well, he was a man of immensely self-conscious dignity, and he was a presence. When he came into a room, he would dominate the conversation, the physical presence. He was always a dominating figure, and certainly at academic meetings, he always took the lead. And he would hold his head like this and appear not to be listening, but he would hear everything. And then when he sat up, And the voice started. Everybody collapsed. Now, people were very angry with him a lot of the time, partly because he was so insistent on his own points of view. And they also were irritated by his personality. Certainly a number of young anthropologists found him intolerable. The ones he favored, when he became interested in somebody, then he was forgiven everything and they became acolytes. But if he was just performing, they did not like him. He was always this sort of mix, and he was very, very British. And politically, there was this strange mixture. His wife was a communist, and he flirted with communism, but didn't ever belong. And but at the same time, he was very understanding about the position of colonial administrators. And many of them were in very difficult situations. I mean, they were not all bad guys. And in this period, in the middle of the 20th century, when people in this country became aware of the liberations of the colonial places, they became so anti-colonial that anything like this was considered intolerable. And he was considered to have been a sort of servant of colonial administration. And he wasn't any more than anybody else was. The story of his fieldwork is very sad. At one point, after he had done a great deal of it, he was in a canoe and he was going to try to shoot a bird. And a man in the canoe stood up at that time, and the man was shot. And Gluckman had to leave, and there was a lot of trouble about this. And he was sort of cut off. And there were other things that people hated about him, and that Nader and others differed with him about. And I tried always to make peace. His interpretation, he did the first study of a court in Africa. And this was an African court run by Africans. But of course it was a colonial court with African personnel. And he sort of ignored that. I mean, it doesn't enter his theoretical frame. And he looks upon the court as a place that expresses and determines the norms of the society. And that in each case, they are using some norm to determine the result in the case. And then sometimes he says quite candidly that he doesn't know what they decided, how they decided. But it's as if he was using an analogy to Western legal ways of behaving and transposing it to this court. And he did that not only about their procedure, but also about their concepts. So he saw them as having concepts of property, of wrongs and rights and things like this, very analogous to those in the Western world. And his father was a lawyer, and so he learned some of his father's conceptions, and he would throw in a little Latin and this and that. Also, he started out, as you can see from one of his books, I don't remember which one, he had the idea that when he went to the Barotse courts, he was going to illustrate one of Sir Henry Maine's theses about primitive law. That this was going to be an example, a living example of Sir Henry Maine's ideas about primitive law. No, all this is rubbish. it's what do we say, a mistranslation of one system into another. But you can winnow out the interpretations and look at what was actually happening, because he describes it clearly enough so that you don't have to take this overlay too seriously. But he was very insistent on this, and he was insistent on it, it seems to me, for very, very nice political reasons, because he wanted to show that Africans were as rational and as logical as Westerners, and that their system was really much more like ours than unlike ours. So you can understand why he was a controversial figure.
Yeah, yeah. And where did your work fit relative to that idea or others that were about at this time? I mean,
well,
because you also worked in the courts.
Yes, but I emphasized the way in which they had been modified, altered, and the way they were adjusting what they were doing for their own purposes. I mean, for instance, in the courts that I went to, one of the things one would assume is that, well, because they could appeal to a court in Moshi, the town nearby, and it could even go higher to higher courts. But the way the judges prevented this from happening was the judge was also the stenographer and the fact finder and everything else. And the judge would say, the evidence does not support the contention of the plaintiff. And so it was always on the factual ground that they made their decisions. So it was impossible to appeal. It was impossible for, no matter how dissatisfied somebody was with the judgment, they couldn't very well appeal. Now, there were exceptions, but this is the general style and technique. Well, this kind of thing, either Gluckman didn't observe or it didn't happen in the court that he was looking at, but I saw much going on that I couldn't fit into the kind of framework that he had posed. But I didn't use it to attack him. You see, this is a difference in style. I wanted him to like me, and I also respected him for what he had done. And anyone who wanted to read this very boring book could have seen that the material would not support his ideas. That was not a public thing. Many anthropologists have advanced their careers by attacking somebody in a prominent position, and that was simply not my style, and I can't tell you why, but what I did was try to characterize the kind of comparisons that were being done in the 1940s and 50s. Well, first of all, before in the 19th century, and then in the 40s and 50s, and then today, and trying to show that the items being compared are completely different. And this, of course, plays into my whole interest in process, and that in fact, if one is interested in, let's say, the process of economic development or the process of political corruption, you can't easily compare the way you could to find out whether a particular people was matrilineal or patrilineal, whether they had gardening or not, whether they had cattle or not, and so on. And so there's been a complete revolution, and that is very much connected with a time-conscious anthropology, a concern with the passage of time and an anthropological description as a moment in time, not a thing, not an object.
What are you working on right now?
Well, apart from trying to sell this book, I'm a man at Oxford has asked me to produce. He's an archaeologist, and he's editing a volume on the archaeology of Kilimanjaro for the Cambridge University Press. But he wants some sort of general article on Kilimanjaro for this book. And I don't know him or anything about this, but I said, look, I wrote a book about Kilimanjaro, and if I can get permission from the people who own pieces of it, because the Cambridge Press owns the right to publish, the University of Rochester owns the copyright. And if I can get both of their agreements to use the text, I will then try to produce a compressed thing that will be suitable for a book of this kind. That's what I'm engaged in at the moment, and it's driving me mad because it's very difficult to compress a 400-page book or 350-page book into 40 pages. I should never have said yes. And the most recent thing I did just before that was an article for this book of John Borneman's, a paper on chance simultaneity, sort of what goes on in the anthropologist's life and environs while she is doing anthropology, and that is not directly germane to the anthropology, but that is germane to the general situation. And so I've included a lot of sort of anecdotal material about what happened when in this strange climbers lodge that I lived in when I worked on Kilimanjaro. And for example, there was a general who came every year to climb the mountain to show that he was still virile and tough. He was very handsome, and he had marvelously polished boots. And I asked him things like, what does the army do in a place like Tanzania when there's nothing doing about wars? He said, the purpose of the army is to keep the government in power. And I thought this was astounding. I mean, it's so candid an answer.
Yeah.
And there were, anyway, some of the things that were happening in connection with all this, with this paper. There was a man, a Chaga, who went to Yale, and who happened to be at Yale when I was there, and he was there in political science. And I helped him to write his dissertation because he really wasn't into what was expected academically. And he wrote it as a sort of propaganda thing. And then I explained to him that that's not what's being asked, and you need to do it another way. And the material in his footnotes then came to be in the body of the dissertation. And he got his PhD and has had excellent positions in the international development world since. But one of the times when I was in Tanzania, he was the chair of, I think it was I've forgotten the name of it, it's somewhere in my notes, a section on development in the university, a section on, and what it really was a sort of espionage thing in which they had to look at where all the government money had gone into development projects, and to see whether any of them had succeeded, and if not, where the money went and what happened and this and that. And he was then a big cheese in the government in this way, because he had his hand on all development projects all over Tanzania, but his actual position was in the university. Now he said to me, if you get into any trouble, this is where you go. Go to my brother. He's in Arusha. You can get there, and he will take care of, protect you. Now, that he should have anticipated that I might have trouble, that he, I never thought of this. And his whole view of the world was quite different from mine. And he's done wonderfully, and I now email him, and he emails me. Life has changed for him as well as for me.